Hello and welcome to a special live Stay Tuned. We are live outside for the first time ever, not just because the weather is nice, but because of what is happening this weekend where we are standing in the Public Media Commons here in Grand Center. It was almost 30 years ago that Eyes on the Prize first aired. It became to be known as the defining documentary of the civil rights movement. This weekend here in the Public Media Commons and on the 9 Network, all 14 episodes of Eyes on the Prize will be airing. We don't have to think back that far to know that if more episodes were made today, St. Louis would be part of the story. So we are excited to kick off the weekend here in the PMC, and we hope you'll stay tuned.
So we're gonna do the show.
Stay Tuned brings together local experts, journalists, civic leaders, and regular people to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Add your voice to our conversation, and you're at the table as we stay on top of current events and go deeper, bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. From the 9 Network of Public Media in Grand Center, this is Stay Tuned.
15 to the roll. 45.
So one reason we have a great sense of pride in Eyes on the Prize here in St. Louis, that's because the man who made the film is from St. Louis, Henry Hampton. Henry's no longer with us, but his sister Judy is here with us tonight to help us get things kicked off. And if people want to know the high school question, Henry went to Salu High, correct? And then you guys grew up in Richmond Heights, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So I guess first tell me, why did your brother want to make this film?
He thought, to begin with, he thought about it when he was crossing the Pettus Bridge with a lot of other people.
He was at Bloody Sunday in 1965.
That's right. And my brother had polio, so one of his legs was in a brace. And he recalls that the people on either side of him sort of intuitively, because he was falling behind, picked him up on either side. He called it his honor guard to walk him across the Pettus Bridge. And one of the things I guess he thought about was this whole thing, this across the Pettus Bridge and all of that, would make great television. And that was how the idea was born.
But he wasn't a filmmaker at the time, correct?
Yes, Henry was always a filmmaker while Eyes on the Prize was on the scene. Before that, he was a public relations executive with the Unitarians. And he went with the Unitarian group to Selma. And that's how this all really started.
And he had the vision for the film when he was experiencing it firsthand.
Exactly, yeah. And when he was trying to raise funds for it, he would show me his, I guess these days you call it a trailer or a teaser, what was in the series. And I couldn't believe he couldn't get funding to do it.
It took a long time.
10, almost 12 years. And the Ford Foundation stepped up and funded it.
It's one of these films that I feel like a lot of people, if you say Eyes on the Prize, they say, "Oh yeah."
Yes.
And then when you see clips of it, you're like, "Whoa, I don't remember that part." So for that reason, let's give people just a little sample.
Absolutely.
Take a look.
The fear that had shackled us all left suddenly when we were together.
If you can't vote, you ain't free. And if you ain't free, well, then you're a slave.
It might seem like ancient history.
He said, "Why don't you stand up?" I said, "I don't think I should have to stand up."
All you niggers, get up from the lunch counter or we're gonna arrest you.
But the stories still resonate for us all.
There was not a black face in sight.
We might as well ask for complete desegregation.
Segregation in the North was dynamic, it was real, blatant, ugly, violent.
What you want is a nation to be upset when one of us is killed.
The Landmark series, which takes you back to see and hear the stories that created a movement.
Movement meant that finally we were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale.
It's not just playing here in St. Louis, it's playing around the country again.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're the reason why. You undertook some fundraising, not unlike your brother, several years I'm assuming the rights had to be purchased and things of that nature to get the film back on the air.
Right.
Why did you want to do that? Why did you want to devote years of your life to a second airing of your brother's work?
That's a good question. At some point I asked myself that because it was so tough. And then one of my colleagues in Boston said, I can help you. Why don't we get a group together and why don't we do this? Because I was frustrated, I was ready to quit. And she and others there on the team helped us to raise that money. So it was very much a team effort.
And then the events of the last couple of years have been broadcast around the world, right out of our backyard here.
That's right. What I say to people is when you look at eyes, you are looking at people who have had enough, who made personal sacrifices, who were passionate about what they were doing. You're looking at leaders, new leaders to be better. So there were a lot of leaders that you don't even know their names. You know Martin Luther King and others, and I respect that. But there's the woman who stayed up all night, 35,000 flyers. She ran off so they could be part of the boycott. It's those people that EYES shows us about, just like all of us, just everyday people.
It's amazing to me how that detail you're talking about there, it's full of those intimate details throughout, but it moves. This could be an example to show in a history class or a filmmaking class. It's just very well done and moves along. There's a lot of passion and emotion in it as well.
I think that's what was so important to Henry, that he created teams to do each one of the episodes that were multiracial and also had very different points of view. So I gather at Blackside there was regularly a fight over how this material would be presented. How could they balance it? How could they make it fair to both sides?
You talk about seeing the faces of 60 years ago. Do you see some similarities in the faces you've seen in the coverage of Ferguson and other cities?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. The same issues are here. This afternoon I had the privilege of having a conversation with some students. And one of the things I asked the young men that were sitting there who happened to be African American, what did it feel like to be profiled? My nephew was kind of regularly profiled, I can't even begin to understand how much anger that builds up with that. And then to see somebody shot down, these issues are right in our face. Some people say, oh, EYES on the prize. That's okay, I got it, that's a while. Not so.
EYES is just as relevant or more so, would you say?
Yes, and that's why we were talking about EYES on the prize then and now. Because we want to show how these two things are very closely connected.
Thank you for all the labor and the work that you've put into bringing it back to us.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And you know what? We want to show people a little bit more of it because it is a very powerful piece of work.
And thank you, viewers.
Thank you, Judy. Let's take another look at EYES on the Prize.
I guess our courage came out because we didn't have nothing, that we couldn't lose nothing. But we wanted something for ourselves and for our children. And so we took a chance with our lives.
We marched up the steps with this circle of soldiers with bayonets drawn. And walking up the steps that day was probably one of the biggest feelings I've ever had. I figured I had finally cracked it.
My freedom is very much entangled with the freedom of every other man. So I'm fighting for my own freedom here.
Are you scared?
Yes, I'm very much afraid. Everyone here is.
In a 10-year period, in the 1950s and 1960s, America fought a second revolution. It was fought in the South by black people and white. It was fought in the streets, in churches, in courts, in schools. It was fought to make America be America for all its citizens. These were America's civil rights years.
I take it then that you are advocating Negroes in New York to stay out of these national chain stores?
Oh, no, that's not true. I'm advocating that American citizens interested in democracy should stay out of chain stores.
All the people of the South are in favor of segregation. And Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, We are going to maintain segregated schools down in Dixie.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people.
Why don't you get out in front of the camera and go on?
It's not a matter of being in front of the camera. It's a matter of...
We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. And that will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man.
It was a hard fight, challenging America's basic beliefs. What is an inalienable right? What is equal treatment under the law? What is liberty and justice for all? It was a hard fight, but the prize was freedom, and no American could afford to lose.
I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
We'll stick with the theme of then and now and talk about St. Louis in this film, not in this film, and then the story that we have to tell today. Let me introduce our guest here for our kind of quasi-round table discussion, minus the table, and we're not even in a round shape. Nevertheless, Gwen Moore, curator, St. Louis History Museum. Thanks for coming back to Stay Tuned. I appreciate it. Alvin Reed from Donnybrook. Thanks for coming back to Stay Tuned as well. Pleasure. And then Christopher Phillips, you're a filmmaker yourself, director of Ferguson 365. Yes. So before we talk about today, Gwen, well, let's just maybe look back just a little bit. Give us the historian's perspective. What was going on when the events captured in this film, in these 14 episodes, were happening? What was going on in St. Louis? Because St. Louis is not in this film.
Yeah. Well, first of all, St. Louis has a very active civil rights movement. If we're talking about the period between 1954 and 1968, a lot was going on. Even before that, St. Louis was very, very much involved in fighting racism and discrimination. You know, St. Louis was an interesting place because it was this blend of North and South. We didn't have legal segregation, but we had segregation nonetheless. In other words, there were only two racially restrictive laws on the books. One that segregated the schools, and one that prevented intermarriage. Blacks could not marry whites, and then later they said whites could not marry Mongolians. But other than that, there were no laws that said blacks could not go in theaters, blacks could not go in hotels, blacks could not go in restaurants, but they couldn't go, whether we had the law or not. So we were fighting these laws from the very beginning. Some historians argue that the first civil rights demonstration on the continent happened here in St. Louis in 1819. Now that's going way back. But we're looking at this period from 1954 to 1968 when historians generally describe the civil rights movement taking place. But of course, we know that there was a freedom struggle before that, and there's a freedom struggle going on now.
A lot of unwritten rules in St. Louis during that time as well.
Absolutely.
Is it important, Chris, I'll ask you, is it important to this current generation to watch this film?
I think it's important because we can see a correlation between what's going on now and what happened back then. And so really, I think it's essential that we look at how history was, what happened and how it played out.
Do people know that history? Do you think, because again, like I said to Judy, this is a film, when you say eyes on the prize, you kind of like, yeah, I know that. What is it exactly? Have they watched this film, or do they know the history in the detail that it is in this piece?
I think it's both things. I think some people are unaware of the film. I think some people are very unaware of the struggles and the tragedies that happened in the civil rights movement. So I think it's important that you continue to show films like this, or even in a theatrical sense, that these stories are told on the big screen, because that way it gives the younger generation the context, because we can't forget the history.
Alvin, I was struck by how helpful, perhaps, having viewed this film would have been for the entire region pre-August 2014.
Well, absolutely, and
because some things do seem very similar.
Well, this the part we saw just looking at it now. I still get chills about the entire thing. I was 25 when this first came out. I was in Danville, Illinois, the first newspaper I worked at. I'm the first black person to cover sports in Central Illinois. It's 1983 when I got there. So to say, 21 years after 1964, I'm still the first doing something. They showed a snippet from Little Rock, and my mom is originally from Pine Bluff, and when I got to Little Rock in 1989, I was a state editor. I ran the bureaus. It's the oldest newspaper west of the Mississippi. I am the only black editor that newspaper ever had because it's since been sold and is now part of another newspaper. So, you look at it and you say, yes, that needs to be not only relived, it needs to be cherished because it is still evolving. In 1971 or 1972, maybe when people say the civil rights movement ended, it was really just starting because it created opportunities for people like myself and then those that have come along after me, much younger than me.
Is it easier to watch something from, it was released 30 years ago, the history that's in it goes back even farther than that. Is it easier to watch that and say what is right and wrong and what history has decided was right and wrong versus how we grapple with issues of today? I'm just curious if that exposure to that film might help with issues of today.
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, we're still struggling with some of those issues. We don't have legal segregation anymore. We have laws that have taken care of that, but that doesn't mean we don't have racism and we don't have discrimination. And I think that's something that we're going to be struggling with for quite some time. And I think this film helps. It puts things in perspective. It helps us to understand what was going on, and it could connect us to the present. So I think this is very helpful to watch this, and it helps us to really understand the issues that were prevalent then and some of the things we're dealing with even today. I think we can see that link.
I mean, I think it's easy to say like what's right and wrong in that film, but what we have to understand is kind of like what she's saying is that it's really just transformed. So a lot of the issues then that may not be present now, they've taken shape in different ways. We still have systemic issues. African Americans are still being targeted. They're just being targeted in different ways. So it's being done through law enforcement, public policy, and so we just kind of have to. I think it's important to look at that, but then also understand that the things that we see in Eyes on the Prize may not be happening anymore, but the problem still exists just because it's transformed.
This is a good time to take a look at Ferguson 365, the film you're the director of. And what I'm thinking of specifically is I was amazed watching Eyes on the Prize how much footage there is, how much footage there was to cull and just really pull the history from. Infinitely more cameras in Ferguson. And I thought it was interesting how you cut together this teaser, this sizzle reel here. Let's take a look from a different perspective physically on this film.
When we're born, we know nothing about anger and pain, conflict. We inherit it from the world in which we live.
Brittany Noble spoke with police who say the officer involved in the shooting didn't know about Brown's involvement in the robbery at that time.
Everybody agrees the guy has his hands up and a cop shoots him anyway.
And Al Sharpton has the nerve to insult the American police community. Men and women risking their lives to protect us.
We're not anti-police, but we're anti-brutality.
We have a broken justice system. It is not fair.
For the second time in as many weeks, a grand jury has found the evidence is just not there to charge a white police officer in connection with the death of a black civilian.
No, they don't! Lives matter!
School and graduate. You know how many black men graduate?
Anything you could have done differently that would have prevented that killing from taking place?
No.
Nothing?
No. If he would have gotten on the sidewalk and followed Dorian Johnson to the sidewalk, I probably never would have noticed cigarillos. I would have gone and gotten lunch and continued my day. He would have continued his.
Henry Hampton did Eyes on the Prize years after much of what he was documenting had happened. What's the challenge of doing it so soon, and why?
I mean, I think the challenge for me as a filmmaker is really to capture the essence of really what was going on. I think the biggest challenge for me is to not make sure that it just identifies only with African Americans, but people across the world, people far removed from Ferguson, and really so that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, people really understood what happened here, really understand the tragedy in it, how a man's life, his humanity was disrespected.
Is this an overwhelming task? Because it seems like it would be.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the volumes of footage.
Yeah, I mean, I shot everything in there with these two hands and been from here to DC and New York and Baltimore. And so it is a challenge. I mean, finding where the story is in a theatrical sense, just telling it, and it was a lot. It was a lot.
And then Judy mentioned her brother was intentional about having a multiracial team work on each episode, and it was intentional about that. Sounds like you have some of those same intentions, whether or not your production team is multiracial, but you're talking about appealing, or not appealing, maybe the wrong word, but reaching a large audience.
I mean, really, actually, the short I did all by myself. So the feature right now, I'm producing and directing it, but I do have a little bit of a diverse team as far as the post-production side goes, but yeah, I mean,
we would love to have any kind of team. We're taking volunteers. In fact, audience, this is where you come into play. You're all going home to edit film tonight. You didn't know this when you got here.
Put y'all on payroll.
Alvin, why does this film hold up today? Eyes on the prize.
Well, I think for one, you were talking about the historical aspect. I've always found it interesting that you have some of the same people who said that the police were this or the police were that, and the protesters were out of control and disrespectful and all that. And then you ask them, well, what about the police in Selma? What about the police in the South during the 50s and 60s? Like, oh, well, they were totally out of control and they were wrong. And you say, well, I feel that same angst because I'm on a Ferguson Street after 11 o'clock, and yes, I'm upset, and yes, I'm yelling, and yes, I'm doing all these things, but at the same time, how am I different from these individuals from back in the 60s? So you look through that lens of history, and a lot of people say, like, no, they weren't wrong, but you were wrong. And I said, how can that be? So I think that's one reason that the film resonates. Another is, I think so many, the names and the places, were not invented. They were real people, they were real events, but they were not people that were honed as civil rights workers, and these towns were not selected for these things to happen. They just occurred. And
organically.
Yeah, and the power of television. I mean, what people get through their telephones now, and I don't mean the information, but just how cool the phone is and what you can do with it. That's how we were with television. And the idea that we could sit there and watch what happened in Selma, Alabama, or what happened someplace else that night on the news, where there was no so-and-so told me or this, that. You saw it, and you got whatever feeling you got. It was real. And that's why that stands up so well now.
And I go back to what it might do for all of us to absorb this history. Spoiler alert, the white folks rioted too, and people were shot when they tried to get one black man into Ole Miss, and 13 people were shot. 2 journalists were killed.
Right.
I don't know if everyone who it was so easy to judge current events. If you didn't, you might have judged differently had you had all of that knowledge. Would say the historian?
Well, if you're asking about this film,
I just wonder if what's the value, and do we have it if we all had a better grasp of the information that is just overflowing in Eyes on the Prize?
There's so much information in that film, and it is just absolutely valuable. I think it really resonates with so many people today because I think that we are still dealing with some of those issues. I was speaking to a group before I came here, and we were talking about the St. Louis Civil Rights Movement. And of course, I started at 1819 and ended with Ferguson, which is a lot of time to cover.
You didn't have 14 episodes.
Didn't have 14, but one of the things I asked when I talked about Ferguson, which I didn't talk a lot about Ferguson. Sometimes when you're a historian, you need a little distance because you're right in the heat of the moment. You're very passionate about these things. But I did ask them, is this a continuation of the Civil Rights Movement, or is this something different? And that was something that people had difficulty grappling with. They knew that there was a connection, but they weren't really ready to say that it was part of the Civil Rights Movement. I think it is, because we're still dealing with, the issues might be different, But the underlying issues are basically the same. We're still dealing with racism and discrimination, people's despair. Blacks are disproportionately poor, disproportionately incarcerated, the new Jim Crow. So we are dealing with these issues of racism and discrimination. They have a different name. They're not as naked, they're not as blatant, but they're still there, and they're still causing problems. They're still causing despair. They're still causing frustration. I always tell people, whether you agree with what happened in Ferguson or not, you've got to understand the issues. You've got to understand why those people reacted the way they did, because they were frustrated. Racism is life. They were tired of it. They just can't deal with it anymore. And they exploded. And that's what happens. And we're going to have more Fergusons, as we have seen, because until we deal with those issues and solve these problems, or at least begin to solve these problems. So that film really has a lot of resonance for people today. They understand it. They feel it. And I think they're going to it's always going to be that way. It's a great historical piece, of course, but it has real relevance today with the issues that we're dealing with today. So yes.
Gwen, we'll have to leave it there because I don't think we could say it any better, and we're just about out of time. So Gwen Moore with St. Louis History Museum, thank you for being here. Alvin Reed, Donnybrook, thanks as always. And Christopher Phillips, Director of Ferguson 365, good luck with the film. And thank you. Audience, thank you for being here tonight with us on our live outdoor show. And all of you at home, the PMC will be showing Eyes on the Prize, as will the 9 Network. And I highly recommend you see it. Thank you, guys.